What happens when a Hollywood legend refuses to play by the rules of modern television? The answer came on a night when millions tuned in expecting an easy interview. A few nostalgic stories, a dash of charm, and the familiar rhythm of late-night laughter. Instead, in under 20 minutes, ABC's Hollywood studio would shift from comedy to confrontation. The audience had come ready to smile. They wanted to see Harrison Ford, the man who flew the Millennium Falcon, cracked Indiana Jones's whip, and carried an entire generation's imagination on his shoulders. At 81, he was supposed to grin, tell some behind-the-scenes war stories, maybe joke about getting older. But that night, Ford had no interest in playing along. Jimmy Kimmel, a veteran host with a sharp grin and a tighter grip on his show, thought he was in control. For 2 decades, he'd turned awkward pauses into applause, tension into timing. But this wouldn't be another neatly packaged segment. This time, his guest wasn't here to entertain. He was here to confront. Ford wasn't selling a movie or feeding the talk show machine. He came carrying something heavier and something personal. The silence that would fall across that studio wasn't scripted. The confrontation that followed wasn't planned. And when Ford finally stood up and walked off set, it wasn't just an awkward moment on live TV. It was a cultural collision. Old Hollywood grit versus new Hollywood politics. Raw authenticity versus rehearsed morality. And from that night forward, late-night television would never look the same. The episode began like any other. A buzzing crowd filled the studio, their laughter blending with the hum of stage lights. The band played its brassy intro, cameras glided in practiced arcs, and producers nodded behind the glass. Everything was in motion, polished, predictable, safe. Then Harrison Ford walked in. At 81, his presence alone demanded silence. Time had carved lines into his face, but his eyes still held that unmistakable steel. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Each step he took onto that stage carried the weight of half a century spent surviving Hollywood's storms. Kimmel greeted him with all the flourish of a showman. "Ladies and gentlemen, the man, the myth, the legend, Harrison Ford." He boomed, drawing thunderous applause. Ford gave a single nod, no theatrics, no extra gesture, before settling into the guest chair. The contrast was stark. Kimmel radiated energy, leaning into every beat. Ford sat still, unbothered, an unmoving pillar against a tide of performance. The first few minutes went as expected. Some jokes, some light stories about stunts and scars. The crowd laughed on cue. Kimmel worked the room. Ford responded in his gravelly tone. It was easy, familiar, safe. But just beneath that polished surface, something had shifted. There was a new edge in Ford's eyes, a quiet sharpness that didn't match the easy flow of jokes. When Kimmel laughed, Ford didn't always follow. When the audience roared, he barely reacted. He wasn't basking in nostalgia or leaning into the warm glow of celebrity. He was waiting. The crowd didn't notice. They were still wrapped in the safety of routine. Kimmel didn't notice either, confident in his rhythm, the veteran host who could steer any guest back to laughter. But Ford knew. This wasn't going to be another promo spot. Not tonight. The rhythm of the conversation shifted. Kimmel's grin, once effortless, turned deliberate. He leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly, and asked the question that would ignite the night. "You know, Harrison," Kimmel began, his voice casual but probing. "You've been in this business over 5 decades. You've seen Hollywood change. What do you think about how the industry handles controversial figures these days?" The words fell like a stone into still water. Ripples of tension spread instantly. Ford didn't move. His jaw tightened. Hands rested firmly on the arms of his chair. A small motion, fingers curling against the wood, betrayed what was coming. The stage lights caught his eyes, now darker, harder. "What do you mean by that, Jimmy?" he said quietly. The tone was even, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Kimmel leaned forward, sensing opportunity. "Well, we've seen actors, directors. People face consequences for what they've said or done. Some call it accountability. Others call it cancel culture. You've never been afraid to speak your mind? Do you ever worry about saying the wrong thing?" The question hung in the air too long. The audience froze, mid-laughter. The energy shifted, no longer playful but charged. A few people shifted in their seats, instinctively aware the temperature in the room had just risen. Ford's grip tightened. He locked eyes with Kimmel. "I think people should be able to express their opinions," he said finally, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. Without being afraid their careers will be destroyed by a mob mentality, silence followed. Not the kind that invites applause, the kind that weighs on the room. Kimmel's grin sharpened. He smelled blood. A viral moment in the making. "That's interesting," he said, tone still smooth but now edged. "So you think some people didn't deserve the consequences they faced?" "Because we're not just talking about unpopular opinions here, Harrison. Some of these cases involve serious allegations." The words landed with precision, pointed, deliberate. Ford leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower, rougher. "I'm talking about principle, Jimmy," he said, measured but firm. "There's a difference between holding someone accountable for real wrongdoing and destroying their livelihood because they said something you don't agree with 20 years ago, or because they don't fit the popular narrative." The studio stopped being an audience and became a courtroom. Every eye locked on the two men under the lights. The energy changed. This wasn't late-night entertainment anymore. It was confrontation. The spark had caught, the first shot fired, the pleasantries were gone. The fight had begun, and as the silence thickened around them, heavy as smoke after an explosion, Jimmy Kimmel's trademark grin finally faltered. There was a flicker of unease in Kimmel's eyes, just enough to betray that he knew Ford wasn't going to hand him the neat viral soundbite he'd been fishing for. Still, he pressed on, leaning into his desk like a man refusing to lose control of his own show. "But Harrison," he said, his tone firmer now, "don't you think actors, celebrities, people with influence, have a responsibility to be careful about what they say, especially when it comes to sensitive topics?" Ford's gaze narrowed. His voice was steady, but it carried steel beneath the calm. "Careful according to who?" he asked. The gravel in his tone cut through the quiet like a blade. "You, the Twitter mob? A corporate boardroom? Or maybe an algorithm written by 20 programmers in Silicon Valley?" The question hit like a punch. Moments ago, the audience had been laughing. Now they sat frozen, uneasy, as if they'd stumbled into a conversation they weren't meant to hear. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged nervous glances. Someone muttered about cutting to commercial, but the red light above the camera stayed on. The show was live, and every second was being broadcast to millions. Kimmel's smile thinned, his tone sharpening. "I wouldn't call it a Twitter mob," he countered. "I'd call it accountability. When people use their platform to spread harmful ideas, there have to be consequences." Ford leaned forward, his frame casting a shadow across the desk. "And who decides what qualifies as harmful, Jimmy?" he asked, voice low but razor-edged. "Who gets to sit in judgment? You network executives, or talk show hosts pretending they're the moral compass of the world?" The words hit like thunder. For the briefest moment, Kimmel's composure faltered before he straightened again, voice tightening. "I think most reasonable people can recognize hate speech when they see it. Harrison, this isn't philosophy. It's about basic human decency." Ford let out a short, humorless laugh, the kind that made the air feel colder. "Basic human decency," he repeated. "That's a convenient phrase, broad enough to mean whatever you want it to mean, handy enough to silence anyone who disagrees." The tension was no longer beneath the surface, and it was alive, crackling through the studio like static before a lightning strike. Cameras zoomed in tighter, instinctively drawn to the heat. The atmosphere was electric, volatile, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Kimmel's jaw set. His entertainer's mask was slipping. "Look," he said, voice rising. "We can all agree racism, sexism, bigotry, and they're wrong. When public figures promote that stuff, they should face consequences. That's not controversial. That's common sense." Ford cut in before he could finish, his words sharp and precise. "There you go again," he said, tone like iron. "Defining the debate so it always works in your favor." The studio went still. Kimmel flushed. His rhythm, setup, joke, applause was gone. This wasn't performance anymore. It was confrontation. "I'm not defining anything," he shot back. "I'm saying harmful behavior deserves pushback. That's how society works." Ford straightened in his chair, his expression darkening. His gravelly voice rolled through the studio with cold, deliberate force. "Society," he said. "Or just your corner of Hollywood. Because where I come from, society isn't built on groupthink in a Malibu mansion or boardroom votes on who's acceptable this week." The audience gasped softly. They weren't watching an interview anymore. They were witnessing a duel. Kimmel's hands tightened on the desk, eyes locked on Ford's. His voice rose, sharp with frustration. "That's rich," he snapped. "Coming from someone who's made millions playing heroes who solve everything with violence. Maybe you're just uncomfortable with a world that demands more nuance than your movies ever did." Ford's eyes flashed, hard and dangerous. His voice dropped, low and measured, every word deliberate. "Don't lecture me about nuance, Jimmy. And don't pretend what you're doing here is anything more than performance art," Ford said, his tone low and cutting. "You take complex issues and turn them into punchlines. You build walls where there could be bridges. You make your audience feel superior to people they'll never meet." The words landed like punches. Kimmel leaned forward, voice cracking under the strain. "I'm trying to have real conversations, honest ones. Maybe that makes you uncomfortable, Harrison. Maybe you've been hiding behind characters for so long you don't remember how to handle the truth." Ford rose slightly, his presence darkening the air. "Hiding behind characters?" he echoed, voice edged with fury. "At least when I play one, I'm honest about it. You sit behind that desk every night pretending to be a moral authority." Silence. No laughter, no applause, just the hum of the lights and the awareness that something irreversible was unfolding. Two men, two worlds. A collision as old as Hollywood itself. Then Ford stood. Slowly. Deliberately. His 6-foot frame seemed to rise like a storm building over the horizon, his shadow swallowing the desk between them. His eyes burned with that same legendary intensity that once froze audiences in theaters. Han Solo, Indiana Jones, faces of courage now turned on a late-night host. Kimmel straightened too, squaring his shoulders, voice trembling at the edges. "You know what, Harrison? You're just another privileged Hollywood relic defending bigotry because it doesn't touch you. You represent everything wrong with old Hollywood." The words cracked through the air like a verdict. Ford didn't flinch. His lips curved, part smirk, part snarl. When he spoke, his voice dropped to a low rumble that carried like thunder. "Old Hollywood," he repeated, tasting the phrase like poison. "We made art, not propaganda. We told stories, not sermons. We respected our audience. We didn't lecture them. We trusted them to think for themselves." The studio was frozen. Even the camera operators, usually ghosts in the background, were locked on their viewfinders, hands trembling as they realized they were recording history. Kimmel's face reddened. His fist clenched around the edge of his desk. "Art, respect? Don't flatter yourself, Harrison. You've spent your life cashing in on fantasy, pretending to be a hero while the real world moved on. You're just an actor who got rich playing pretend." The insult struck hard, but Ford didn't flinch. His calm was deadly. He stepped closer, towering over the desk, eyes fixed on Kimmel with predator stillness. "When this ends, Jimmy," he said softly, "I'll go home and sleep knowing I've lived with integrity. Can you say the same?" The silence was absolute. Kimmel's mouth opened, but no sound came. The mask cracked, the practiced charm, the composure, all of it. He looked out toward the audience, the cameras, searching for escape, but there was none. Ford leaned in slightly. "I've spent 50 years earning the trust of audiences," he said, voice now rising, solid and sure. "I've risked my life for what I believe in. Put my body on the line. What have you risked, Jimmy?" And for the first time all night, Jimmy Kimmel had no punchline. "Broken bones," Ford said, his voice low but carrying. "That's what it took to give people something real. Something honest. And what do, Jimmy? You sit behind that desk every night, passing judgment, turning complex issues into punchlines. You tear people down so your audience can feel superior for 10 seconds before the next ad break." Each word hit like a hammer. Kimmel's face drained of color. His trademark smirk was gone, stripped bare under the weight of Ford's words. He tried to respond, but Ford cut him off, his tone slicing through the air. "You call it accountability," Ford snarled. "But what it really is, what you really do, is destroy. Reputations, careers, discourse, all for ratings. All for applause." The audience didn't breathe. Their eyes flicked between the two men like spectators at the final rally of a match. But this wasn't a game. It was a reckoning. "I use my platform to fight for what's right," Kimmel shot back, his voice rising in desperation. "To call out hatred. To give a voice to people who don't have one. That's more than hiding behind movie roles and staying silent when it matters." Ford's laugh was short, sharp and humorless. He took a step closer, and suddenly his presence filled the room. "Silent?" His voice thundered now. Don't you dare lecture me about silence. I fought battles you can't imagine. I've seen oppression, consequences, loss, and I didn't need applause to face them. I didn't need validation from a crowd. Kimmel's jaw clenched. His voice trembled between anger and fear. You think because you've lived longer, because you've played heroes, that makes you an authority on moral courage. You're just an old man clinging to a past that doesn't exist anymore. For a moment, Ford went perfectly still. Then he leaned forward, bracing one hand on Kimmel's desk. His voice dropped to a near whisper, but it carried more power than a shout. You want to know the difference between us, Jimmy? His eyes burned. I don't need to destroy people to feel important. I don't need to label everyone who disagrees with me a monster just to win an argument. Real strength isn't tearing people down, it's building them up. That's something you'll never understand. Kimmel froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The confidence was gone. The mask, the entertainer, the crusader had fallen away, leaving only a man exposed beneath the lights. Ford straightened slowly, adjusting his jacket with quiet precision. When he finally turned to face the audience, his voice was calm, resolute. You came here for entertainment, he said, his tone steady but filled with gravel. Not another sermon. Not another lecture about how broken the world is. And the fault. His eyes flicked briefly to Kimmel. Lies with those who confuse celebrity with wisdom. The silence was absolute. No laughter. No applause. Not even the shuffle of movement. Just the electric hum of truth filling the space. Ford took a breath, the storm still smoldering behind his eyes. Then with a slow, deliberate turn, he walked toward the wings. Each step echoed final, undeniable. It was the sound of a man done playing the game. And behind him, Jimmy Kimmel broke. His voice cracked as he called out, desperate now. Harrison, wait. We can work this out. Ford stopped at the edge of the stage. The audience held its breath as he turned, just enough for the lights to catch the lines of his face. The anger was gone. What remained was heavier. Disappointment. No, Jimmy, he said quietly, his voice calm but cutting straight through the silence. Working it out means listening, and you've forgotten how. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. No one moved. Not the crew. Not the audience. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, their red lights blinking like nervous eyes. Then Ford walked off stage. Slow, steady, unhurried. The echo of his footsteps faded into the wings. Kimmel stood frozen behind his desk, pale and hollow-eyed. His mouth opened once, then again, but no words came. The once unshakable host now looked small beneath the studio lights, stripped of his armor before millions. The silence was suffocating. For the first time in his career, Jimmy Kimmel had no comeback. And Harrison Ford was gone. For a few long seconds, the studio stayed in stunned paralysis. Then came the murmurs, soft, uncertain, growing like a wave. A few audience members reached for their phones beneath jackets, filming in quiet defiance of the no-recording rule. Security moved in too late. The moment had already escaped. By midnight, grainy clips flooded social media. Hashtags erupted across platforms. Within hours, every timeline, every feed, every news outlet was ablaze. Half the internet hailed Ford as a truth-teller who said what others were afraid to. The other half called it a meltdown, an old actor lashing out at modernity. Either way, the world couldn't look away. By morning, the footage was everywhere. Talk shows, podcasts, headlines, all dissecting the confrontation frame by frame, tone by tone. Every glance, every pause, every breath became analysis fodder. It wasn't entertainment anymore. It was history. Days later, the fallout was impossible to ignore. Kimmel's ratings plunged. Viewers called him vindictive, smug, out of touch. For the first time in years, his grip on late-night television felt shaky. Ford, meanwhile, emerged untouched, elevated even. That night didn't just reaffirm his legacy. It reshaped it. He was no longer just a Hollywood legend. He was something rarer, a man who spoke truth without needing permission. At 81, Harrison Ford had nothing left to prove. And yet somehow he had proven something anyway. For Kimmel, it was a reckoning, the hard lesson that influence is not the same as respect. For Ford, it was a stand, unflinching, unfiltered, unforgettable. They came for entertainment. Instead, they witnessed the moment television remembered what truth looked like.